Hello, my name is Richard Santos, and I'm going to be going over the difference of wired versus wireless networks. This is for ITT 370. For starters, of course, we're going to go over the major differences between both the wired and wireless networks. Of course, connection, mobility, the maintenance setup, and the redundancy and reliability. In terms of connectivity, wired networks they are using physical cables. This establishes the connections between the devices, while wireless networks utilize radio waves for that data transmission through the air. So there really isn't much need for as many physical cables. When mentioning mobility, wireless networks, that this is where they thrive more. They offer greater mobility since the devices can connect to the network without being physically tethered to a specific location. Um, and then just the setup. Wired networks, they require more effort and resource for that installation and maintenance. Wireless networks, they're generally just easier and quicker to set up. They do require additional maintenance to ensure optimal performance with security, different factors like that signal interference and range limitations, which we can get into later. And the redundancy and reliability of each network. Wired connections, they can offer a faster and more reliable transmission compared to wireless connection. However, wireless does bring more ease and comfort with the setup. There are issues with signal strength, potential interference, depending on that distance from the access point, the obstacles that are from the access point to the host device, the end user. Of course, moving on, the OSI model, we'll just briefly go over layer 1 and layer 2 of the model. So as for the physical layer, in both wired and wireless networks, this layer it does deal with the transmission and receiving of data uh, over a medium. Within wired networks, it involves the use of physical cables, connections, and wireless networks, it just involves more of that modulation and demodulation of radio waves for its communication. For layer 2 and the data link layer, it's just mainly responsible for a reliable transmission of data. Um, in wired networks, the layer often uses protocols just to manage the transfer and receiving of data over the cables, while in wireless, it just involves Wi-Fi, right, radio waves like we mentioned, and of course handles different aspects of a MAC address to gain communication with the device and that network. Um, they do, of course, both adhere to the OSI model with those differences in connection. It's just mainly that establishing that connection and then, of course, managing the physical and data link aspects to transmit data with each. As for security risks, the biggest thing for wired networks is just physical access. They are less vulnerable since, of course, it requires access to the actual infrastructure with the cables, the access to the ports on the equipment. Of course, different security measures are in place. Like some facilities always have a security guard, cameras. You require a badge or some method of authentication to get into those secure environments. Wired networks are generally more secure against like eavesdropping, which is a network attack, compared to a wireless network. But of course, having that physical access to the infrastructure, it can still happen. It can be conducted, and of course that brings a big point into like insider threats. That does pose a significant risk to wired networks. Um, they of course could tamper with cables, which then disrupts connectivity, gain data and information that's very sensitive, and I mean those are really the big things in terms of wired security risks, wired network security risks, excuse me, in comparison to wireless network security risks. Just like anything unauthorized access, that's a big one. However, it could be thought as more susceptible since radio waves are in the mix with the wireless connection. That of course extends beyond any physical boundary in comparison to wired connection. Attackers can intercept those signals and gain access to the network. There are different measures in terms of security that are integrated and implemented to avoid that, but if not, that's obviously a big issue. Uh, Other issues like rogue access points. If you're at Starbucks and you're trying to connect to the Starbucks guest Wi-Fi, somebody could actually just make a rogue access point that just has a name similar to that. And if you're not, obviously analyzing it too much, and you just click on that ready to connect because you want to just have a stable connection, or at least what you think, that's a good way for an attacker to trick the user into then connecting and exposing any data on your end, whether it's bank account information, work information, so on. Interference is a big issue. Wireless networks are more vulnerable to that interference can be developed through electronic equipment surrounding the access points, physical obstacles, etc. Really, like which just degrades signal quality, disrupts communications overall. In terms of security and operational attributes, frequency interference, signal propagation, wireless protocols, physical security are some of the big ones we'll go over here initially. Um, when mentioning that frequency interference, it's more of like the radio waves, how we discussed earlier with wireless networks. That's what they mainly operate over. They are more susceptible to this interference. And of course, different sources of electronic devices, like I mentioned, different networks, the physical obstacles that could, of course, degrade the overall quality, reduce that throughput with the communication from the host to the network. The propagation with the signal, of course, that wireless signal can pass through walls and other obstacles, which does bring a lot of flexibility depending on the placement of the access point. But it could also, increase the risk of signal leakage, unauthorized access, and so on. Different protocols, of course, relying on, I know the ones written WEP, WPA are more legacy technologies, but WPA2, which is, I guess a little older now, that helps to encrypt data and authenticate users, just so that way we can ensure that there's not many vulnerabilities that can exploit issues in the network by attackers. Physical security, of course, wireless networks are prone to issues with like remote access. That's more unlike wired networks. It's a bigger deal because it doesn't really matter if it's a short range or a long range. It's just very important to implement security measures to prevent those access issues, like a VPN. If it's more on, obviously it's always good to use a VPN in general, since that will secure the transmission of data through that tunnel that a VPN creates. And just the last few, authentication and access. Like written here, the wireless networks and wired networks, they use authentication methods. Really, what I mean more so by this is just the employment of those authentication mechanisms. You can use passwords, pre-shared keys, certificates, and that helps to verify the identity of users and devices. So of course, implementation of like stronger authentication and access control is just very important to prevent unauthorized access and to protect data that is very sensitive. And the signal, like I've already kind of talked about, the coverage of wireless signals, it can vary depending on factors with distance from the access point, different environmental conditions. So just planning and optimizing the most appropriate placement for the access point will increase signal coverage and just ensure a more reliable connection. And lastly, I'll just go over some strategies just to lessen security risks. So just encryption in general is very important. Uh, the newest technology, WPA3, it just aids and helps for securing wireless communication. It encrypts uh, data by scrambling it and then transmits over the network. It just makes it harder for an attacker to read that information and prevent unauthorized users from gaining it. Just securing the authentication. Same thing, WPA3 is very important for that. And we've already kind of discussed it, but it just is more of an involvement of authenticating through a credential, username and password, or digital certificates. Segmenting the network through VLANs is also a great tactic, just to restrict access to sensitive resources. For example, if you have a business and you have two different projects or contracts like working let's say you have one that's specific to financial means, while the other side of the house is maybe more for like medical information. Just putting on them separate VLANs is great because if you need some information from one department, they can just transfer you over, and for the network's sake, that stuff is secure. Intrusion detection and prevention systems. Just the monitoring of wireless traffic, detecting potential vulnerabilities and threats, and then dealing with them real time is a great security measure. It does take a little bit of setup, but of course you just have a networking team kind of aid with that. Somebody that has a uh, good professional background in that. And lastly, just auditing information, very similar to like documentation. I think that's always one of the most important aspects because auditing data just to gain more knowledge on vulnerabilities, misconfigurations, security weaknesses, and so on. It's just great to come together with that information in team meetings just to see what can basically help remediate any issues in the future, and potential updates and patches that are required. What's more vulnerable, the patch, or to avoid that one for the meantime. But of course, you typically keeping everything up to date to the latest firmware and updates. That's usually the most important aspect to implement. And really a big one, I should have wrote in here, but just user training, educating end users. Of course, like cybersecurity training is it's pretty important in any business construct that's using like network connections to access data. Just and in practicing the best thing you can when it comes to that, and advising your users to avoid public Wi-Fi hotspots, follow the proper password policies and other policies that are in place for network connection, authentication, and so on. And then just recognizing any type of phishing attempts or attacks and then reporting it to IT security or whoever the outlet is within your company. And that will wrap up this presentation for, of course, wired versus wireless networks. And here are my references here.